Imagine if the greatest lie in Silo was never about the outside world. Not the poisoned air. Not the fake green landscape. Not even the surveillance hidden inside every wall. What if the biggest lie is much older than all of that? What if the silos were never built to save humanity? They were built to replace it. That sounds impossible. After all, every character we've followed believes the silos are humanity's final shelter. Every law, every sacrifice, every execution is justified by one simple sentence. The silo keeps us alive. But here's what changes everything. Have we ever actually seen proof that saving humanity was the original purpose? Not what Bernard believes. Not what judicial teaches. Not what the pact says. Actual proof. Because the moment you stop accepting the official story, something terrifying begins to appear. Look at what the show is actually telling us. Every major revelation exposes another lie. Every answer destroys the answer that came before it. Every authority figure claims certainty until they're replaced by someone who knows even less. That's not how a survival system works. That's how a controlled experiment works. And that difference changes everything. Because a shelter exists to preserve people. An experiment exists to observe them. Those are two completely different goals. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Think about the first question everyone asks inside the silo. Why can't anyone go outside? It feels like the central mystery. But that's not the real mystery. The real mystery is, why does every generation ask the exact same questions? Generation after generation. People rebel. People investigate. People disappear. History repeats almost perfectly. That shouldn't happen. Human civilization changes over time. Knowledge accumulates. Mistakes become lessons. Unless someone is making sure history never moves forward. This is the detail everyone missed. The silo doesn't simply erase information. It erases progress. Those aren't the same thing. If survival were the goal, every generation would inherit more knowledge than the last. Engineers would improve systems. Scientists would preserve discoveries. Doctors would expand medicine. Children would know more than their parents. Instead, the opposite happens. Knowledge becomes dangerous. Curiosity becomes criminal. Questions become acts of rebellion.
Why?
Because knowledge doesn't threaten survival. Knowledge threatens control. And if knowledge is the enemy, then survival may never have been the priority. Let's look at Bernard. Most viewers see him as a dictator, a manipulator, the man protecting terrible secrets. But what if Bernard isn't protecting humanity? What if he's protecting the experiment itself? Notice something strange about him. Whenever someone discovers forbidden information, Bernard doesn't react emotionally. He reacts procedurally, almost mechanically. He doesn't seem interested in revenge. He's interested in containment. That's a completely different mindset. It's almost as if he's following instructions written long before he was born. Instructions he doesn't fully understand. Because Bernard himself often behaves like someone trapped inside a system rather than someone controlling it.
Think about that.
If he were the mastermind, he would know everything. Instead, he constantly discovers new truths himself. He's frightened.
He's surprised.
He's forced to adapt. That means Bernard isn't sitting at the top. He's somewhere in the middle. A manager, not an architect. Someone maintaining rules created by people who disappeared centuries ago. But here's the terrifying part. If even Bernard doesn't know the original purpose, then who does? Or perhaps, no one inside any silo does anymore. And this is where it gets darker. Think about the pact. The show presents it as sacred, necessary, untouchable.
But why?
Every civilization writes laws. That's normal. What's unusual is treating those laws as if they're beyond questioning forever. Real societies update constitutions. They change policies. They adapt. The silo refuses to evolve. That isn't stability. That's preservation. Like preserving a laboratory exactly as it was designed. Almost every rule inside the silo limits one thing. Not violence. Not crime. Information. Relics.
History. Maps.
Technology. Astronomy. Hard drives.
Books.
Every forbidden object shares one characteristic. It connects people to a larger reality. Ask yourself, if humanity is barely surviving extinction, wouldn't those things become priceless? Wouldn't old knowledge be humanity's greatest weapon? Instead, they're treated like biological contamination.
Why?
Because contamination ruins experiments. One piece of outside information can change human behavior. One photograph, one memory, one forgotten document. Suddenly the subjects stop behaving naturally. Look at what the show is actually telling us. The leaders aren't afraid of relics because relics are dangerous. They're afraid because relics break the illusion. And experiments collapse the moment the participants realize they're inside one. Now think about Juliet. She doesn't simply solve mysteries. She introduces variables. Everywhere she goes, predictable systems become unpredictable. People who followed rules begin asking questions. Communities start changing. Old assumptions collapse. It's almost like Juliet isn't dangerous because she's strong. She's dangerous because she creates uncertainty. In a survival bunker, independent thinkers are valuable. You need people who solve impossible problems. But inside the silo, independent thinkers become enemies. That contradiction should bother you, because it suggests the system fears adaptation more than failure. Why would any civilization fear adaptation? Unless adaptation threatens the true purpose of the silo? And once that possibility enters your mind, every event in the series begins pointing toward one terrifying conclusion. The silos may not be humanity's final refuge. They may be humanity's longest-running test. If the silos are a test instead of a sanctuary, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. What exactly is being tested? Most viewers assume the experiment is simple. Can human beings survive after the collapse of civilization? But look closer. Human survival was solved the day the first silo was sealed. Food is produced. Water is recycled. Air is filtered. Children are born. Life continues. If survival was the only objective, then the experiment should have ended generations ago. Instead, it continues. Century after century. That changes everything. Because when an experiment continues long after its original question has been answered, it usually means the researchers are measuring something else. And this is where it gets darker. Look at what the show is actually telling us. Every crisis inside the silo is caused by human behavior, not failing machines. People hide information. People lie. People fight over power. People become obsessed with forbidden truths. Even when technology works, society begins to fracture. That pattern repeats too often to be an accident. The system doesn't just keep people alive. It constantly creates pressure. Pressure reveals character. Pressure exposes weakness. Pressure forces impossible choices. Almost like every generation is being pushed through the exact same psychological examination. Not to see whether humans can live, but to discover what kind of humans emerge under complete control. Think about mechanical. For years, the people living in the lower levels are treated as if they simply maintain the machines. But that's not the full picture. Mechanical represents something much deeper. They understand how things actually work, not politically,
Physically.
Juliet grew up surrounded by broken engines, damaged pipes, worn gears, and impossible repairs. She learned one dangerous habit. When something breaks, you don't accept it. You open it. You investigate it. You understand it. That mindset is the opposite of the culture above. Higher levels teach obedience. Mechanical teaches curiosity. This is the detail everyone missed. The conflict between the upper and lower levels isn't about class. It's about two completely different ways of thinking. One group survives by following instructions. The other survives by questioning systems. And every time someone from mechanical climbs upward, the balance begins to collapse. Juliet doesn't threaten Bernard because she wants power. She threatens him because she looks behind every panel, every locked door, every impossible rule. That's exactly what an experiment fears most. Someone who refuses to observe the test and instead starts examining the laboratory. Now think about the hidden rooms scattered throughout the silo. Whenever a secret chamber is discovered, viewers naturally ask what's inside. But that's not the real mystery. Ask a different question. Why are there so many hidden spaces at all? A survival bunker has limited resources. Every room should serve a clear purpose. Storage, agriculture,
Power.
medicine. Nothing should be wasted. Yet the silo contains places that ordinary citizens were never meant to know existed. Observation rooms, restricted archives, hidden technology, private corridors. Almost as if someone designed layers of access. The deeper someone climbs into the truth, the fewer people are allowed to follow. That isn't efficient engineering. That's controlled information architecture. Exactly the kind of design you'd expect inside a research facility, not inside humanity's last home. And then there's surveillance. Most people think the cameras exist to stop crime. But crime isn't the biggest threat inside the silo. Ideas are. Look carefully. The system rarely reacts first to violence. It reacts to curiosity. People asking questions. People finding relics. People connecting pieces that should never fit together. That's incredibly revealing. Because surveillance isn't protecting lives. It's protecting a narrative. A narrative is far more fragile than concrete walls. One person discovering the truth can undo centuries of carefully managed belief. That's why information spreads like an infection. One conversation becomes 10. 10 become a movement. Eventually, control disappears forever. So the system attacks the first question before it becomes the 100th. Now, let's talk about cleaning. This ritual has always felt strange. People are sentenced to leave the silo. They clean the camera. Then they die. At first, it seems symbolic. Almost ceremonial. But look deeper. Why clean the lens? Why is that specific action so important? The official explanation sounds reasonable. Keep the camera clear. Allow everyone inside to see the outside world. But here's what changes everything. The cleaning isn't really about the camera. It's about behavior. Every condemned person is shown a beautiful world through their helmet. Almost all of them respond the same way. They clean. Exactly as expected. Almost like the system already knows what decision they'll make. That's not punishment. That's prediction. And prediction only matters if you're measuring behavior. The ritual becomes another data point. Another confirmation that human beings react to carefully controlled stimuli in predictable ways. The condemned don't choose freely. They're guided, observed, recorded. If that's true, then cleaning has never been about the people inside the silo. It's about whoever designed the experiment proving that the experiment still works. Now, let's turn to the founders. They're spoken about almost like mythical figures.
Wise.
Visionary. Necessary. But the more we learn, the less human they feel. Real founders leave explanations. Blueprints. Personal records. Arguments. Disagreements.
History.
The founders of the silo leave something very different. Rules. Protocols. Restrictions. Silence. That silence is disturbing because it removes motive. Without motive, every explanation becomes an assumption. Were they heroes? Villains? Scientists? Governments? Corporations? The show refuses to answer. And maybe that's intentional. Because if the founders wanted future generations to understand them, they would have preserved their reasons. Instead, they erased almost everything except obedience. That sounds less like leadership and more like programming. So now the pieces begin fitting together. The erased history, the forbidden relics, the endless surveillance, the carefully repeated rebellions, the hidden rooms, the rigid hierarchy, the ritual of cleaning. None of these are random mysteries anymore. They're components of the same machine. A machine designed not just to preserve life, but to shape it, to filter it,
To study it.
to decide which version of humanity deserves whatever comes next. And if that's true, then every person inside every silo has spent their entire life believing they're survivors, when they may actually be subjects in the longest psychological experiment ever created. Now everything leads to one final question. If the silos were never built to save humanity, who were they built for? Most theories stop at control. They argue that someone wanted power, so they created a society built on lies. But that explanation feels too small. Power only matters if someone is still there to enjoy it. The people who designed the silos have been gone for generations. So, why does the system still function with such precision? Why do the rules outlive the rulers? That's not how dictatorships usually end. History tells us that once leaders disappear, their systems begin to collapse. Yet the silos don't collapse. They continue almost exactly as intended. That suggests something terrifying. The founders didn't build a government. They built a self-sustaining system, one that no longer needs its creators. And this is where it gets darker. The real villain may not be Bernard, or judicial, or any single person. The real villain is the design itself. A design so complete that every new leader simply steps into the same role. They believe they're making choices, but the system has already made those choices for them. Look at Bernard again. He's often presented as the man with all the answers. Yet every major decision he makes is based on instructions left behind by people he's never met. He protects rules he didn't write. He enforces traditions he doesn't fully understand. He sacrifices people because the system tells him he must. Ask yourself, is Bernard controlling the silo? Or is the silo controlling Bernard? That difference changes everything. Because if the leaders are prisoners too, then no one inside the silo is actually free. Now think about Juliet one last time. Most heroes fight to defeat a villain. Juliet is fighting something much harder. She's fighting an idea. The idea that truth is dangerous. The idea that obedience is safety. The idea that survival is more important than freedom. Every discovery, she makes chips away at that belief. She doesn't destroy walls. She destroys certainty. And that's why she's so dangerous. Not because she's stronger than everyone else, but because she forces people to ask a question they've been trained to avoid. What if everything we've accepted is part of the problem? This is the detail everyone missed. The greatest threat to the silo isn't rebellion. It's independent thought. Once someone begins thinking for themselves, the system starts to fail. One question becomes another. One secret leads to 10 more. Eventually, fear loses its power. That's why every authoritarian system in silo reacts the same way. Not with debate. Not with evidence. With silence. With censorship. With erased history. Because lies cannot survive investigation. But here's the biggest piece of the theory. We've been assuming the silos exist because the outside world is dangerous. What if that's backwards? What if the outside world stayed dangerous because the silos existed? Think about it. Imagine thousands of the brightest engineers, doctors, scientists, and workers being locked underground. Generation after generation. All of humanity's talent separated into isolated populations. No collaboration. No shared innovation. No rebuilding. No chance for civilization to recover together. Instead of saving humanity, the silos may have prevented humanity from ever recovering. That's a horrifying possibility. The system doesn't just preserve life. It freezes history. It traps civilization in an endless loop where every generation starts over with less knowledge than the last. The people inside believe they're waiting for the world to become safe. But maybe that's exactly what ensures it never does. And then there's something even more unsettling. Notice how every revelation in Silo makes the world feel larger. First, the mystery is one staircase. Then it's one camera. Then it's one hidden level. Then it's one hard drive. Then it's another silo. Every answer expands the scale instead of reducing it. That's not accidental storytelling. It's a warning. Every truth is only the edge of a much bigger truth, which means we've probably been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of asking, who built the silos? Maybe we should ask, who designed the future they wanted humanity to become? Because those are completely different questions. One is about construction. The other is about intention. And intention is far more dangerous. Now imagine the ending of Silo through this theory. Not a battle between heroes and villains. Not a final escape to the surface. Something much more unsettling. Juliet discovers that opening every door doesn't automatically create freedom. Because the greatest prison was never concrete. It was belief. The founders didn't need armed guards forever. They only needed one generation to accept the rules. That generation taught the next. The next taught another. Eventually, people defended the prison themselves. That's the perfect system. One that no longer needs force because the prisoners believe the walls are protecting them. And that's why this theory feels so disturbing. It doesn't just explain the silos. It explains human nature. How easily fear becomes tradition. How tradition becomes law. And how law can survive long after everyone forgets why it existed. So, maybe the final twist of Silo won't be discovering what's outside. Maybe it'll be discovering that the greatest disaster didn't happen on the surface. It happened the moment humanity accepted that survival without truth was enough. Because once people stop asking questions, they stop deciding their own future. And if Season 3 keeps pushing this mystery forward, we may discover that escaping the silo was never the real challenge. The real challenge is escaping the mindset the silo was built to create. Because if one silo can shape generations, what happens when every silo has been running the exact same experiment? And if someone or something is still waiting for the results, what is the final version of humanity they're trying to create?